The ideas you're talking about are all fairly big ideas and sort of huge by modern political terms. Sort of completely rethinking our means testing programs and Social Security and Medicare. And is it possible in America today to do all of that? I mean, people would argue that George Bush got into trouble when he tried to bite off more than he could chew, that maybe you can do one big thing, but if you try to do too many things, none of them will act. Is that, you've been at the center of power before, is that a fair criticism, that maybe you only can do one of them? And so which one?
No, I think it depends on how you frame the question. If you get a country which says, you know, we need to get our act together again, we need to become the most dynamic country in the world again, we need to create dramatic economic growth again, then the country's going to do 40 things if that's what it takes to get there. Because the one thing you're doing is this big thing, getting us to be dynamic. And part of our problem is that very few political figures are prepared to think through all the linkages. It's as though you had a car which had 4 flat tires that run out of gas and needed to have somebody come along and jump-start it. And different politicians came along and they did one thing. They each said, I'm going to do one thing. So I'm going to change the tire. And then the car didn't start. I mean, because they hadn't fixed the car. All they'd done is the one thing. You know, Reagan, take Reagan. Reagan, on the one hand, did very little things. There's a wonderful story of Reagan deciding that he would go to Berlin. He'd gone to Berlin in 1967 as governor, and he had a throwaway line. He said, that wall sure is ugly. They ought to tear it down. 20 years later, re-elected, having carried 49 states, he's going back to Berlin. And he remembers that line, and he says, I want to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. The State Department took it out. It came back to the White House, it was edited out. Reagan hand wrote it back in. It went back to the State Department. It came back. I was told this story by Secretary of State George Shultz. Reagan wrote it in a second time. It went back over. It came back taken out again. Reagan picked up the phone, called the Secretary of State and said, Georgie, I want you to tell your editor, I'm the president, they're not. It stayed in. Now I didn't know this story until a couple of weeks ago. The morning they're in Berlin, and we have this scene in the movie clips that I made about Reagan. The morning they're in Berlin, the senior staff begs him to take it out. They said, you're going to irritate Gorbachev, and you're going to look stupid because the wall's going to be there for 30 or 40 more years. And of course, fell 2 years later. Reagan ignored him, cheerfully do. Here's why I'm telling the story. Somebody who understood nothing could hear that story and say, this was a president who was trapped in minutia. Why would a president of the United States fight over one line in a speech? Or you could say the following. This was a man who since 1947 had been studying communism, who had a grand strategy for the defeat of the Soviet Empire, and who believed that moral dominance was one of his biggest weapons. And he was engaged in breaking the Soviet Empire, and any detail that helped him break the Soviet Empire was worth his attention. Now notice the difference in how you think of it. I think that what we have to do at the presidential level is say, these are the 3 big things America needs. Reagan had 3, I think 3 is the right number, just mythically. His 3 were simple. Rebuild the American economy by cutting taxes and regulations and praising entrepreneurs. Rebuild American civic spirit, reminding us why we're American and what it means to be American. Defeat the Soviet Empire. If you think about it, it's an amazing, astonishing 8 years. And here's a man who in 8 years accomplished all 3. Now, there were 100 things he didn't do particularly well. The way I describe it is, Reagan understood that lions have to hunt zebras and antelope because if they catch chipmunks, they starve to death. and that Reagan was a genius. Reagan would get up every morning and say, what are my zebras and antelopes? Rebuild the economy, renew American civic culture, defeat the Soviet Empire. He'd walk into the Oval Office about 10 in the morning, and chipmunks would run it. And the federal government has $10 billion chipmunks. And Reagan was very patient and pleasant, and he'd say, you know, you are a terrific chipmunk. Have you met Jim Baker? And his chief of staff became the largest chipmunk collector on the planet. But if even a tiny thing for his three major goals came in the office, his adrenaline pumped up, his attention pumped up, he focused tightly. He spent 6 months studying Gorbachev before the first summit. Took everything we knew from every intelligence agency in the world for 6 months. Because that mattered. Because he was going to take apart the empire. So what do we have to do? We have to rebuild American civic culture and reassert American exceptionalism. We have to rebuild the American economy and as a consequence, balance the budget and shrink the federal government. We have to maintain our national security so we don't lose a single city and we're not defeated anywhere on the planet. Those are the only three things we have to do. If we get those three things done, lots of secondary things will take care of themselves.